All right, let's dive in. We're going nano today. Nano-enabled agriculture. You guys sent in a ton of research on this, so we had to call in an expert to help us sort through it all. It seems like everyone's super curious about how this tech could change farming as we know it, and honestly, I'm right there with you.
What gets me really pumped is how nanotech can tackle some of the biggest problems in agriculture right now, like keeping our soil healthy and using resources more efficiently.
Exactly. It's like we're using the power of the super tiny to make massive changes in how we grow our food.
That's it. And to really grasp how it all works, we got to start with the basics. Nanomaterials are these crazy small particles. At least one dimension has got to be less than 100 nanometers.
Okay, so wait, how small are we talking? Like, give me a comparison I can wrap my head around.
Picture a sheet of paper. Now, that sheet is about 100,000 nanometers thick, so we're dealing with stuff thousands of times smaller than a human hair.
Whoa, that's tiny. But what's the big deal about being so small? What makes these nano-sized things so special?
That's the key. At that size, materials start acting totally different. They can get stronger, react more easily, even change how they interact with light.
So it's not just about shrinking things down, it's like opening up a whole new world of possibilities with these materials.
Exactly. Now, how do we even make these nanomaterials? Well, we have a few ways. One is we can take bigger materials and break them down to the nanoscale. That's called the top-down approach. Or we can build them up atom by atom through chemical reactions. That's the bottom-up approach.
I have a feeling there's a more, I don't know, natural way to do it too, right?
You know it, there's the biological method. We often call it green synthesis. Basically, we use living things like bacteria or fungi to make these nanomaterials. It's pretty wild, actually.
Wow, think of those tiny organisms as like nanofactories.
Speaking of which, a lot of the research you sent in was all about how these nanomaterials can actually improve soil health. That's got to be huge for farmers.
Huge. Nanomaterials can boost soil health in three main ways: physically, chemically, and biologically. All right, let's break it down. Let's start with the physical benefits. How can these little particles actually change the structure of the soil?
Imagine building tiny scaffolding in your soil, creating this network of nano-sized pores. These pores help water drain better, let the soil breathe, and stop it from getting too compacted, which is great for roots to grow strong.
Okay, so it's like giving the soil a structural makeover at the microscopic level. Gotcha. What about the chemical side of things?
Chemically, nanomaterials can act like tiny delivery trucks for plant nutrients. Things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. They can either be the nanofertilizers themselves or act as carriers for other agrochemicals, making them work better and reducing waste.
So instead of just dumping fertilizers in and hoping for the best, we can use these nanomaterials to get those nutrients exactly where they need to be.
Bingo. That precision leads to less fertilizer use overall, a smaller environmental footprint, and healthier plants in the end. For example, zeolites. They're a type of nanomaterial that can hold onto nutrients and release them slowly over time so the plants get a steady supply without polluting the environment.
It's a win-win for both the farmers and the planet. Now, I know you're big on the whole soil microbiome thing, all those tiny critters that are essential for healthy soil. How do these nanomaterials interact with that hidden world?
It's a complicated dance, and we're still figuring a lot of it out. But we know some nanomaterials can actually stimulate the good microbes in the soil, which leads to better nutrient cycling and overall plant growth. There's research showing that silver nanoparticles can boost nitrogen fixation in pea plants by helping those nitrogen-fixing bacteria thrive.
It's like giving the soil a probiotic boost. But hold on, if some nanomaterials can help these microbes, could others potentially harm them too?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one researchers are looking into seriously. While many show promise, some, like copper oxide nanoparticles, have actually been shown to negatively affect certain bacteria and fungi. It just shows how important it is to do our research carefully and choose the right nanomaterial for the job.
So it's about finding that balance,
Yep.
the right nanomaterial for the right situation, and understanding how it affects the entire soil ecosystem.
Exactly. And speaking of ecosystems, the benefits of nanomaterials go way beyond just the soil. We're also looking at how they can help us tackle some major environmental challenges.
Now we're talking. How can these tiny things take on issues like pollution and climate change?
Well, one way is by helping to cut down on those greenhouse gas emissions coming from the soil. You see, soil is a major source of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Certain nanomaterials like biochar nanoparticles can actually trap carbon in the soil and keep it from being released into the atmosphere.
So they're helping to capture and store carbon, keeping it locked away. instead of contributing to climate change.
That's the idea. And when it comes to pollution, some nanomaterials have shown real potential for cleaning up contaminated soils. For example, iron sulfide nanoparticles have been successfully used to reduce chromium contamination, making the soil safer for plants and everything else living there.
It's crazy how something so small can have such a huge impact on these big environmental problems. So we've got nanomaterials boosting soil structure, nutrient delivery, and the soil microbiome, and they're even helping us fight climate change and pollution. It's like a multi-pronged attack on the problem.
And we're just getting started. There's still so much to learn about how we can use nanomaterials in agriculture. But before we go any further, I think we need to talk about what happens to these nanomaterials once they're out in the environment.
Yeah, good point. Do they just hang out in the soil forever, or do they change over time?
They're not just sitting there.
Yeah.
Once they hit the soil, they go on a wild ride, undergoing a bunch of transformations that can actually change the properties and what ultimately happens to them.
All right, let's follow along on this journey. First stop, the soil. What kind of changes are we talking about?
Think of the soil as this bustling city full of minerals, organic matter, and tons of microbes. Nanomaterials enter that world, and they can physically stick together, forming bigger particles. Chemically, they might dissolve, releasing ions, or go through redox reactions, which change their oxidation state.
So the soil is like a constantly changing environment that's always interacting with and reshaping these nanomaterials. Makes sense. But what about when they come into contact with plants? Do plants actually absorb them?
They can. Understanding how they get into plants and move around inside is really important when we're looking at both the good and bad they can do. There are two main ways they get in. The apoplastic pathway, which is basically like squeezing between cells, and the symplastic pathway, where they actually travel inside the cells themselves.
It's like two different routes through the plant's internal highway system.
Yes.
So once they're in, where do these nanomaterials end up?
They can end up all over the plant, but they tend to build up in certain areas. Fruits, grains, flowers, and young leaves are like hot spots. Those parts act like sinks for nutrients and other substances.
Interesting. So does that buildup in the parts of the plant we eat mean anything for food safety?
That's a really important question, and scientists are studying it like crazy. We need to know if nanomaterials can accumulate in the food chain and if that could have any effects on human health.
It's a complex web we're trying to untangle. We're still learning so much.
For sure. And that's why if we're going to develop and use nanotechnology in agriculture responsibly, we need to be really careful and do our due diligence when it comes to risk assessment.
Absolutely. Well, we've covered a lot of ground already. We talked about what nanomaterials are, how they change in the soil and plants, and even how they might affect the environment and our food. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to shift gears a bit. Let's talk about the tools and techniques that come with nanotechnology. It's not just about the nanomaterials themselves. It's like having a whole new toolkit for improving soil and plant health.
Great analogy. Nanotechnology gives us this whole new set of tools to monitor, manage, and even clean up our soils in ways we never could before.
All right, let's open up that nano toolkit. First things first, nanosensors. What are they and how are they being used in agriculture?
Nanosensors are like these super tiny, incredibly sensitive detectors. They can keep tabs on a whole bunch of things in the soil and plants, giving us real-time data on moisture levels, pH, nutrient availability, even if there are any plant diseases popping up.
It's like having a tiny lab right there in the field, constantly monitoring the health of the soil and crops. Any cool examples of these nanosensors in action?
Oh yeah, tons. For example, researchers have developed these carbon nanotube-based sensors that can actually detect the levels of nitrate and phosphate in the soil. This lets farmers fine-tune their fertilizer applications, so they're giving the plants exactly what they need, when they need it, without any waste.
So it's all about using tech to make farming more efficient and sustainable. What other tools are we working with here?
We've also got nanoadsorbents. Think of them like tiny sponges that can soak up pollutants from the soil and water. They're being used to remove heavy metals, pesticides, and other contaminants, which is a big help for cleaning up polluted areas.
It's amazing how something so small can make such a difference in cleaning up the environment. What about nanocatalysts? What role do they play?
Nanocatalysts can really speed up chemical reactions. Scientists are looking at using them for all sorts of things in agriculture, from improving soil properties to breaking down harmful organic pollutants, which basically makes the soil healthier and safer.
So they're like little accelerators, making things happen faster and more efficiently in the soil.
Gotcha. Now, what about nanofilters? What do they fit in?
Nanofilters are showing some real promise for making soil better and even cutting down on greenhouse gas emissions. They can help with water retention, nutrient availability, and even boost microbial activity in the soil.
It sounds like nanotechnology is giving us this whole arsenal of tools to tackle some of the biggest problems in agriculture and environmental management. It's really impressive. But let's be real, even with all this incredible potential, we got to talk about the potential risks of using nanomaterials. With great power comes great responsibility, right?
You got it. While nanomaterials have huge potential, we need to be smart about how we use them. Careful research is key to making sure we're using them safely and responsibly.
So let's talk about the potential downsides. What are some of the risks we need to be aware of when it comes to nanomaterials in agriculture? One concern is that some nanomaterials could be toxic to plants. Some might help them grow, but others could be harmful, either by being directly absorbed by the plant or by releasing toxic ions. This toxicity can mess with plant development and ultimately affect how much food we can grow.
So choosing and testing these nanomaterials carefully is super important to avoid any unintended consequences for the plants themselves. What about the bigger picture? Could nanomaterials pose a risk to the rest of the ecosystem?
That's another big question. Nanomaterials can stick around in the soil for a long time, and there's a worry that they could build up in the food chain and potentially harm animals or even people. We need to figure out how these nanomaterials move through the environment and what their long-term effects might be.
It sounds like we've got a complex web of interactions to figure out before we can fully embrace nanotechnology in agriculture. Are there any other concerns we should be thinking about?
Yeah, there are also ethical, legal, and social issues to consider. We need to make sure nanotechnology is developed and used responsibly, with transparency and regulations in place to protect both people and the environment.
That's a really important point. It's not just about the science, it's about the ethical side of things and how society views this tech as well.
Absolutely. We need to have open and honest conversations about the good and the bad of nanotechnology, and everyone needs to be involved. Scientists, policymakers, farmers, and the public.
Well said. This has been an awesome conversation, and I feel like we've just scratched the surface of this whole nano-enabled agriculture thing.
We definitely covered a lot, from what nanomaterials are and how they work in the soil and plants to some of the risks and ethical considerations.
But there's still so much more to discover. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll dig deeper into specific types of nanomaterials and how they're being used in agriculture today. We'll also talk about some of the cutting-edge research and innovations that are shaping the future of this field.
Can't wait to dive in.
Until then, thanks for joining us on this journey into the nano world of agriculture.
All right, welcome back. Last time, we got the basics down, talked about what nanomaterials are and how they act in the agricultural world. Now let's get specific. Let's talk about the different types of nanomaterials out there and what makes them so cool.
Hit me with those nano superstars. What are some of the most popular nanomaterials in agriculture, and what makes them so special?
Well, one of the big ones is silver nanoparticles. They're like little warriors fighting off those nasty fungal and bacterial diseases in plants. They've got these awesome antimicrobial properties that make them super effective as nanopesticides, which means we can rely less on those traditional chemical pesticides.
They're like a tiny shield protecting the crops from those harmful pathogens. Awesome. What other nanomaterials are making a splash in the agricultural world?
Oh, we've got zinc oxide nanoparticles, too. They're another powerhouse. They also have those antimicrobial properties and can actually provide zinc directly to the plants. Zinc is like a superfood for plants, essential for healthy growth. Researchers are even looking at them as nanofertilizers, delivering zinc straight to the plants in a way that's super efficient.
So it's like a two-for-one deal, protection and nourishment. I've also heard about titanium dioxide nanoparticles. What's so special about them?
Those are super interesting. Titanium dioxide nanoparticles have what we call photocatalytic properties. Basically, they can speed up chemical reactions when they're exposed to light.
So they're like little solar-powered machines. What can they do?
Oh, tons of things. We're talking about breaking down pollutants in soil and water, making fertilizers work better, even boosting photosynthesis in plants.
That's wild. So they're using sunlight to improve plant health and help the environment. Pretty cool. Now, thinking about the problems farmers deal with all the time, are there any nanomaterials that specifically target things like soil erosion or water shortages?
You bet. Silica nanoparticles are getting a lot of attention for their ability to improve soil structure and water retention. They can act like glue, binding soil particles together to make the soil more resistant to erosion. And they're really good at holding on to water, which is a game changer in places where drought is a problem.
So they're giving the soil a double boost, stronger structure, and more water. Amazing.
Earlier, we talked about nanofertilizers. Can we dive into some specific types and how they work?
Sure. One cool example uses chitosan. It's a natural polymer we get from shellfish. We can use it to encapsulate nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, creating this slow-release system that makes those nutrients last longer and prevents them from being lost to the environment.
So it's a more targeted and eco-friendly approach to fertilizing. The plants get the nutrients they need, and we don't waste any or pollute the environment. Exactly. And what's really neat is that we can customize nanofertilizers to address specific nutrient deficiencies in different soils. Like iron is a big problem in many areas. Researchers are developing nanofertilizers that can deliver iron directly to the plant roots in a form they can easily absorb. Healthier plants, better yields.
It's like a custom-made nutrient cocktail for the plants. This is seriously impressive stuff. It seems like there's a nanomaterial solution for almost every problem in agriculture. What about the future? What are some of the most exciting developments on the horizon for nano-enabled agriculture?
Oh, the future is wide open. One area that has a ton of potential is smart nano-delivery systems. Think about it. Tiny capsules that only release fertilizers or pesticides when certain conditions are met, like when the soil gets too dry or when a pest attacks a plant.
That's insane. It's like having a microscopic team of robots working in the soil and plants, always watching and responding to their needs. Precision agriculture on a whole new level. What else are scientists working on?
Another hot topic is nanobionics. That's where we actually integrate nanomaterials with plants to make them even more awesome. Imagine plants that could tell us when they need more nutrients by glowing in the dark, or plants that can suck up pollutants from contaminated soil, like self-cleaning bioremediation systems.
That's like something out of a sci-fi movie. The possibilities with nanobionics are mind-blowing. What other crazy advancements are coming down the pipeline?
Well, we're also making progress in using nanomaterials to create disease-resistant crops. Researchers are looking at coating seeds with nanoparticles to prevent fungal infections, or even developing nanovaccines for plants to protect them from viral diseases.
So we're talking about giving plants a nano-powered immune system. Amazing. It feels like the potential of nano-enabled agriculture is limitless.
It really does. The field is exploding with new discoveries and innovations all the time.
But like we talked about before, we need to be cautious and make sure we're developing this tech responsibly. We need to balance those benefits with potential risks.
Couldn't agree more. Responsible use and thorough risk assessment are essential. We want to make sure nanotechnology helps both people and the planet.
Well said. This has been a fascinating look at the different nanomaterials being used in agriculture and a glimpse into the exciting future of this field. But, as we know, even the most promising technologies can have downsides. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll shift our focus to the critical issue of risk assessment and talk about the steps we're taking to ensure that nanotechnology is used safely and responsibly in agriculture. Stay tuned. All right, we're back for the final part of our nano-enabled agriculture deep dive. We've talked about all the amazing things these tiny particles can do, but now we need to get real about the risks. Every new tech comes with potential downsides, and this is no different.
You're absolutely right. Nanomaterials have incredible potential, but we need to be smart about how we use them. We've got to look at both sides of the coin, the good and the bad, and be really careful.
So how do scientists even begin to assess the risks of using these nanomaterials in agriculture? I mean, these things are tiny, and their interactions with the environment seem incredibly complex.
Risk assessment is a pretty involved process. We have to look at what could potentially be hazardous about a specific nanomaterial, and then figure out how likely it is that those hazards could actually harm people or the environment.
Okay, so break it down for me. What are the big things scientists look at when they're assessing the risks of nanomaterials?
Well, one of the most important things is the nanomaterial itself. They're not all created equal. They have different properties, their size, shape, surface charge, what they're made of. All these things can affect how toxic they are, how easily they move around in the environment, and how they interact with living things.
So we can't just lump them all together. Each one needs to be looked at individually, right?
Exactly. Another big factor is concentration. Just like with anything, too much of a good thing can be bad. Higher concentrations of nanomaterials in the environment are more likely to be a problem.
That makes sense. It's all about finding that right balance, getting the benefits without causing any unintended harm. What about the environment itself? Does that play a role in risk assessment?
Oh, absolutely. A nanomaterial might act completely different in sandy soil compared to clay soil, or in freshwater versus saltwater. Things like pH, temperature, even what other substances are present, can all affect what happens to a nanomaterial and whether it has a negative impact.
It sounds super complicated, like trying to solve a puzzle with a million pieces. So how do scientists study all of this? What methods do they use?
They use a bunch of different tools: lab experiments, field studies, computer modeling. It's all about getting a complete picture.
Okay, so let's start with the lab. How do those experiments help?
Lab experiments let scientists really control the environment. They can study how a nanomaterial affects cells, tissues, or even whole organisms in a setting where they can isolate specific variables.
So it's like a really controlled setting. Makes sense. What about field studies? What do they bring to the table?
Field studies take the research out into the real world. Scientists can see how nanomaterials behave in complex environments like soil, water, and air. They can track where they go, how they interact with plants and animals, and get a sense of their long-term effects on the ecosystem.
Sounds like field studies are crucial for seeing how these things actually work outside the lab.
Right.
What about computer modeling? How does that help?
Computer models are awesome tools. Scientists can use them to simulate what a nanomaterial might do in different environments. They can run all sorts of scenarios and predict how it will move, transform, and interact with living things. This can help identify potential risks and guide future research.
It's like a virtual lab where they can test things out before releasing those nanomaterials into the real world.
Yeah.
Smart. But how do we translate all this research, all those experiments and models, into actual rules for using nanomaterials safely?
That's where regulatory agencies step in. They look at all the scientific data and then develop guidelines and standards to make sure nanomaterials are used safely. These might include things like labeling requirements, how to handle them safely, even limits on how much of a nanomaterial can be used in certain products.
So it's about putting some guardrails in place to protect people and the environment while still allowing this new tech to grow. Are there already any regulations in place for nanomaterials specifically in agriculture?
Oh, yeah. Many countries are working on regulations for nanomaterials in agriculture. For example, the European Union already has rules about labeling and using nanomaterials in pesticides and fertilizers, and they're constantly updating these regulations as we learn more.
That's good to know. It sounds like they're taking this seriously, and the regulations are based on real science. But with nanotechnology changing so quickly, how can we make sure those regulations keep up?
That's a huge challenge.
Mhm.
Regulations have to be flexible, They've got to be able to change as new research comes out. Scientists, policymakers, and industry folks need to work together to make sure the rules are always up to date and relevant.
So it's an ongoing process of evaluating and adapting.
Yeah.
But in the end, it's about finding that sweet spot between innovation and safety. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the fascinating world of nano-enabled agriculture.
It's been a blast exploring this complex and rapidly evolving field with you.
We've learned so much. We talked about what nanomaterials are, how they could change agriculture, and how they could even help us deal with some serious environmental problems. But as we've seen, it's crucial to approach this new tech with a balanced view. We need to be excited about its potential while also being really aware of the risks and making sure we use it responsibly.
Well said. It's a really exciting time for nanotechnology in agriculture. I can't wait to see what the future holds.
Me too. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey into the nano world of agriculture. We'll catch you next time for another deep dive into the world of cutting-edge science and tech.